I was driving home later than usual, the kind of late where the streets feel emptied out on purpose, like the city has quietly agreed to give up for the night, and the rain had started again in a thin, patient way that made the windshield shimmer. It was just after 1 in the morning, and the radio was off because I wanted the silence, even though silence always feels heavier when you're alone inside a moving car. The road was familiar, one I'd driven hundreds of times, but at night it felt narrower, darker, as if the buildings had leaned in slightly while no one was watching. The rain wasn't loud, just enough to keep the wipers moving in a steady rhythm that matched my breathing, and I remember feeling strangely calm, almost detached, as if the drive was happening without much input from me. Ahead, the traffic light at the main intersection turned red, glowing sharply against the dark sky, and I slowed down without thinking, easing my foot onto the brake. The car came to a smooth stop at the line, the engine humming quietly, and for a moment everything felt exactly as it should. I sat there watching the rain slide down the glass, counting the seconds in my head, waiting for the light to change, feeling suspended between places. That's when I noticed the car to my left roll forward through the intersection. At first, I assumed the light must have changed and I'd missed it, so I glanced up quickly, but my light was still red, solid and bright. The car didn't speed or hesitate, it just continued through calmly, headlights cutting through the rain, as if the rules didn't apply to it. I felt a flicker of irritation, the kind you get when someone else breaks a simple rule, and I watched it disappear down the road. Then another car followed. And another. They moved smoothly through the intersection from every direction. Not rushing, not stopping, just flowing forward while I stayed where I was. I checked my light again, my eyes lingering on the red circle, expecting it to flicker or change, but it stayed the same. For a second, I wondered if my lane was delayed, some odd timing glitch, and I told myself to wait. The rain kept falling, the wipers kept moving, and the world beyond the windshield continued as if nothing was wrong. Pedestrians crossed the street in front of me, umbrellas low, coats pulled tight, not even glancing in my direction. I leaned forward slightly in my seat, gripping the steering wheel tighter, feeling a faint pressure in my chest that I couldn't quite explain. The car behind me didn't honk, didn't inch closer, and when I checked the mirror, there was no one there at all. The lane behind me was empty, stretching back into darkness, like I was the last car left in this direction. I looked to my right and left again, watching traffic flow past me, headlights and taillights blurring together in the rain, and the sense of being left behind settled deeper. I checked the clock on the dashboard, half expecting the time to be frozen, but the numbers were still moving forward, 1 minute at a time. I shifted in my seat, uncomfortable now, and lightly tapped the brake, just to feel something respond. The car didn't move, of course, but the lights still didn't change. I waited longer than any red light should last, and started counting again, this time out loud, my voice sounding too loud inside the car. At 30, nothing changed. At 60, the intersection still moved without me. Cars slowed, turned, accelerated, and vanished down side streets, and I stayed perfectly still, like I had been excluded from the pattern. I felt a strange urge to just go, to ignore the light and move forward, but the thought made my stomach tighten. The red light felt deliberate somehow, like it was aimed specifically at me. I glanced up at the traffic camera mounted above the intersection, the small dark lens watching silently, and I wondered if it could see me sitting there. The rain thickened slightly, blurring the edges of the world, and I felt oddly exposed, sitting in a pocket of stillness while everything else flowed around me. A bus rolled through the intersection, its interior lights glowing warmly, faces inside turned forward, unaware of me. I watched it pass and felt a brief, sharp envy that surprised me. I tried pressing the accelerator gently, just to test it, but my foot hesitated before touching it, like my body didn't want to commit. The light stayed red. I checked my phone, the bright screen hurting my eyes, and saw that I'd been sitting there for almost 7 minutes. That made no sense, and the realization settled in slowly, like cold seeping through fabric. I put the phone down and looked around again, really looked this time, searching for something I'd missed. The buildings around the intersection seemed slightly off, their windows too dark, their shapes a little flatter than they should have been. The sound of traffic felt distant now, muted, like it was happening through thick glass. I rolled down my window a few inches, letting the cool air and rain mist in, hoping it would ground me. The sound of the rain was softer than I expected, almost careful. I leaned out slightly, looking up at the light from below, trying to see if it was malfunctioning, but it looked normal, unchanged. I raised my hand and waved it in front of the dashboard, half laughing at myself, half testing reality. Nothing responded. A cyclist rode past me, close enough that I could see the water dripping from his jacket, and he didn't look at me either. I wanted to call out, to ask if he saw what I saw, but the words stayed stuck in my throat. I felt suddenly tired, deeply tired, like waiting had drained something out of me. The red light reflected in the wet hood of my car, glowing steadily, unblinking. I noticed then that the rain wasn't accumulating on my windshield the same way anymore. The droplets slid off too cleanly, too evenly, like they were avoiding the glass. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my knuckles pale, and I became aware of how quiet my own car was compared to everything else. No engine noise, no vibration, just stillness. I turned the key slightly, checking if the engine was still running, and the dashboard lights flickered, then steadied. The car was on. I was there. But something about being there felt provisional, like I was only allowed to exist in this paused space. I watched another cycle of traffic pass through, counting cars, trying to anchor myself in something measurable. 12 cars went by. Then 15. None stopped. The light for them changed naturally, smoothly, and the light for me stayed red. I wondered what would happen if I got out of the car, and the thought made my chest tighten with quiet dread. I imagined opening the door and stepping into the rain, imagined the world continuing without acknowledging me at all. The idea felt wrong, like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. I stayed seated, breathing slowly, telling myself to be patient, that patience always worked eventually. The red light didn't waver. I felt a growing sense that time was passing differently for me, stretched thin and slow, while the rest of the world moved on at its own pace. The realization didn't come with panic, just a deep, unsettling acceptance. I watched a couple cross the street holding hands, laughing at something I couldn't hear, and felt strangely distant from them. They disappeared into the rain without looking back. I checked the rearview mirror again, hoping to see another car pull up behind me, but the road was still empty. It felt like I was parked at the edge of something, waiting for permission that might never come. The rain eased, then stopped, and the sudden quiet pressed in harder than before. The red light seemed brighter without the rain to soften it. I took a deep breath and pressed the accelerator just a little harder this time, enough to feel the engine respond. The car lurched forward an inch, then stopped, like something invisible was holding it in place. My heart jumped, and I quickly eased off, my hands shaking slightly. I sat back, staring at the light, feeling watched in a way I couldn't locate. I thought about all the other nights I'd stopped at this same intersection, how unremarkable it had always been. That familiarity made this feel worse, not better. The light finally flickered, and for a brief, hopeful moment, I thought it was changing. It stayed red. I laughed quietly, a dry sound that didn't feel like it belonged to me, and rubbed my eyes. When I looked again, the intersection seemed farther away, like the distance had subtly increased. The buildings felt flatter, the street wider, the space around me less defined. I checked my phone again, my hands clumsy, and saw that another 10 minutes had passed. No missed calls. No messages. Just time moving forward without me. I turned my head slowly, looking out the side window, and noticed that the reflections in the glass didn't line up quite right. My face looked slightly delayed, my movements trailing by a fraction of a second. The sight made my stomach drop. I turned back to face forward and forced myself to focus on the light, on something solid and familiar. The red circle glowed steadily, patient and unmoving. I wondered how long I could sit here before something changed, or before I did. The thought lingered, heavy and unanswered, as the world continued to move through the intersection without waiting for me. I first noticed her because she was standing too still for that time of night, positioned under a streetlight that flickered just enough to make the shadows feel restless, and I remember thinking she looked like someone paused in the middle of a thought. It was close to midnight, the hour when the city thins out and every sound feels intentional, and the air was cool with the promise of rain that hadn't started yet. I had been walking home alone, taking the longer route again because the quiet felt easier than going back to an apartment that still didn't feel settled. My footsteps echoed softly on the pavement, and I was aware of them in the way you become aware of your own breathing when nothing else is happening. She stood near the edge of the sidewalk, not blocking my path, not moving toward me, just present in a way that made me notice her without knowing why. At first, I assumed she was waiting for someone or checking her phone, but her hands were empty, resting loosely at her sides. As I got closer, I realized her face was turned slightly toward me, her eyes fixed in my direction, and that made my pace slow without me deciding to. I glanced around instinctively, expecting to see someone else she might be watching, but the street was empty in both directions. The streetlight above her hummed faintly, and the light caught her face unevenly, making it hard to read her expression. She looked calm, not smiling, not tense, just attentive, like she was listening for something. I told myself to keep walking, that stopping would only make things awkward, but my attention stayed on her in a way I couldn't shake. When I was only a few steps away, I felt a sudden, sharp awareness of my own name, as if someone had just thought it very clearly. Then I heard it. She said my name, clearly and unmistakably, in a voice that sounded close enough to belong to her. I stopped walking immediately, my heart jumping, the sound of my name echoing in my head. But her mouth hadn't moved. She was still standing there, lips closed, expression unchanged, eyes steady on mine. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it, if my mind had filled in a sound that wasn't really there. I swallowed and looked around again, searching for another person, another source, but the street remained empty and quiet. The sound of my name lingered, not like an echo, but like a memory that had just been created. I looked back at her face, half expecting to see her smile or react, but she didn't. Her lips stayed closed, relaxed, as if she hadn't spoken at all. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words didn't come right away. When I finally managed to ask if she just said something, my voice sounded thin and unfamiliar to me. She didn't respond. She didn't nod or shake her head or blink noticeably, just continued to look at me with the same quiet focus. The silence between us stretched, and I became aware of how exposed I felt standing there under the light. I laughed softly, an automatic reaction to discomfort, and told myself this was just a misunderstanding. But then I heard my name again. This time it felt closer, almost inside my head, spoken with the same tone, calm and certain. Her mouth still didn't move. I felt a chill spread across my arms, and I took a small step back without meaning to. She remained where she was, but her eyes followed me, tracking the movement precisely. I asked her how she knew my name, my voice louder now, and the question hung unanswered in the air. She didn't react, didn't shift her weight or change her posture, and that stillness made the space between us feel charged. I became aware of the faint sound of wind moving through the street, of distant traffic far away, and how none of it seemed to touch this moment. I thought about all the ways someone could know my name, co-workers, neighbors, acquaintances, but none of them fit her face. I had never seen her before, I was sure of that, and the certainty made my stomach tighten. I took another step back, and again her gaze followed me, slow and steady. My name came again, softer this time, like it was being repeated to get my attention. I pressed my lips together, my heart pounding now, trying to convince myself I was misinterpreting my own thoughts. I raised my hand slightly, gesturing toward her mouth, and asked her to speak out loud. She didn't. Her lips stayed closed, unmoving, and I noticed then how relaxed her jaw was, how natural the stillness looked. The realization that she physically wasn't speaking made the sound of my name feel heavier, more invasive. I felt suddenly aware of my own thoughts, as if they weren't as private as they should have been. I wondered if anyone passing by would notice what was happening, but the street remained empty, the moment contained. I took another step back, then another, my movements slow and deliberate, and each time I heard my name again, matching the rhythm of my retreat. She didn't follow me, didn't step forward, just stayed where she was, rooted beneath the light. The distance between us grew, but the sound didn't fade, staying just as clear. I turned my body slightly, angling myself away, and the sound stopped abruptly. The sudden silence felt wrong, like something had been cut off mid-sentence. I paused, my breath shallow, and waited. Nothing happened. Slowly, I turned back to face her. She was still there, still watching me, and the quiet stretched again. I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, like the start of a headache, and I rubbed my temples without looking away from her. I told myself to leave, to just walk past her and not look back, even though the idea made my chest feel tight. I took one step sideways, then forward, passing her at a careful distance. As I did, I felt the sound of my name one last time, not heard but felt, like a breath against my thoughts. Her mouth never opened. I didn't stop walking after that. I kept going, my pace steady but tense, listening for footsteps behind me that never came. I didn't look back until I reached the next block, and when I did, the streetlight behind me was empty. She was gone, as if she'd never been there at all. The rest of the walk home felt stretched and thin, every sound making me flinch slightly, every shadow catching my attention. When I reached my apartment, I locked the door and stood in the quiet, listening to my own breathing. I said my name out loud once, just to hear it spoken normally, and the sound felt strange in my mouth. That night, lying in bed, I kept replaying the moment, trying to remember exactly how her voice had sounded. I couldn't. I only remembered the certainty of it, the way my name had arrived without sound. Sometimes now, when I'm alone and the room is quiet enough, I feel that same awareness again, like my name is being held just out of reach. And I wonder how many times it's been spoken without my noticing, by someone whose mouth never needed to open. I noticed the window on my way home from work, when the sky was already dark but the night hadn't fully settled, that in-between hour where everything feels unfinished. It was raining lightly, the kind of rain that doesn't soak you but makes the air feel heavy, and I had my collar turned up as I walked the familiar path toward my apartment building. I'd lived there for almost a year, long enough to know which lights were usually on and which windows stayed dark, and that's why the movement caught my attention. One of the windows on the third floor flicked from dark to light, then back to dark again, too quick to be someone switching a lamp, and it made me slow my steps. At first, I thought it was just a reflection, maybe a car passing or lightning far away, but the sky stayed flat and gray, offering no explanation. I stopped under the awning near the entrance, rain tapping softly above me, and looked up again, feeling vaguely embarrassed for staring. The window stayed dark for several seconds, long enough for me to relax and tell myself I'd imagined it. Then it happened again. Light on, light off, quick and deliberate, like a blink. A strange tightness settled in my chest, the kind you get when something feels wrong but harmless at the same time. I counted silently, waiting for it to happen again, trying to turn it into something predictable. Nothing happened. I shook my head, annoyed at myself, and reached for the building door, telling myself that living alone had made me too sensitive to small things. As I stepped inside, I glanced up one last time, just to be sure, and the window stayed dark, watching me in its stillness. The lobby smelled faintly of damp concrete and old paint, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in a way I'd never liked. I checked my mailbox, flipped through a couple of useless flyers, and tried to let the moment fade as I headed for the stairs. My apartment was on the third floor, the same level as the window I'd been staring at, and the thought brushed against my mind without fully forming. I climbed slowly, listening to my footsteps echo, each one sounding slightly louder than it should have. I'd lived there for almost a year, long enough to know which lig. When I reached my floor, the hallway lights were on, casting the same dull yellow glow they always did, and everything looked normal. I passed the window from the inside without thinking about it, keeping my eyes forward, unwilling to invite the feeling back. Inside my apartment, I locked the door, dropped my bag, and stood for a moment in the quiet, letting the familiar space settle me. The rain tapped against my own windows now, a soft, steady sound that usually helped me relax. I made dinner, ate standing up, and turned on the TV just to have another sound in the room, though I didn't really watch it. Every so often, my eyes drifted toward the dark glass of my living room window, reflecting my own movements back at me. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that windows don't blink, and the thought felt almost convincing. Later, when the apartment was quiet again and the rain had slowed to a faint drizzle, I turned off the lights and went to bed. I lay there listening to the building settle, pipes ticking softly, distant footsteps somewhere below, and my breathing slowly evening out. Just as I started to drift, a sudden brightness pressed against my closed eyes. I opened them and sat up slightly, my heart picking up speed. Light had filled the room for just a second, then vanished, leaving the darkness feeling thicker than before. I stared toward the window, my outline faintly reflected in the glass, and waited. Seconds passed. Nothing happened. I lay back down, telling myself it had been a car's headlights, even though the street below rarely saw traffic that late. Sleep came in shallow pieces, broken and uneasy, and each time I woke, I felt like I'd missed something. In the morning, gray light filled the room naturally, and the night's tension felt distant and foolish. I went about my routine, showered, got dressed, and almost forgot about the window entirely. It wasn't until I left the building that the feeling returned. I stepped outside and instinctively looked up, my eyes finding the third-floor window without effort. It was dark, as it should have been, and for a moment I felt relief. Then it blinked. Light on. Light off. Exactly once. I stood there longer than I meant to, my bag hanging from my shoulder, rain misting my face again. A neighbor brushed past me, nodding politely, and didn't look up at all. I wondered if anyone else could see it, or if it was something meant only for me. All day at work, the image stayed with me, the rhythm of that brief flash replaying in my thoughts. I caught myself checking the time often, waiting for evening without knowing why. When night came again, the rain returned with it, steady and patient, like it had unfinished business. I delayed going home, walking extra blocks, stopping at a cafe I didn't need to visit, just to put it off. Eventually, there was nowhere else to go. As I approached the building, my heart beat a little faster, and I hated that I could predict where my eyes would land. The window blinked before I even fully stopped walking. This time, it stayed lit for a fraction longer, long enough for me to see the empty room beyond it. No furniture. No movement. Just light, then darkness again. I stood frozen, rain soaking into my shoes, trying to understand why an empty room would signal me at all. The idea that it wasn't the room doing it crept in slowly, unwelcome and persistent. I went inside without looking again, my body moving on instinct while my thoughts lagged behind. Up in my apartment, I didn't turn on any lights at first. I stood in the dark, facing my own window, watching my reflection merge with the night outside. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, faintly, from across the narrow gap between buildings, a light appeared. On. Off. On. Off. Slower now, deliberate, like it knew I was watching. I didn't move, afraid that any response would encourage it. The blinking continued, irregular but persistent, and I felt the strange certainty that it wasn't trying to communicate, only to confirm something. Eventually, the light went dark and stayed that way, leaving me alone with my reflection and the quiet. I slept poorly after that, and in the days that followed, I avoided looking up whenever I entered or left the building. Still, sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I catch a brief flash against the rain-streaked glass. I never looked directly anymore. I'm not sure what would happen if I did, and that uncertainty watches me now, patient and unblinking. I noticed the keys because they were lying in the middle of the road where nothing ever stayed for long, not trash, not leaves, not even rainwater, and the sight of them made me slow my steps without realizing why. It was close to midnight, the street quiet in that fragile way it only gets after the last bus has passed, and the rain had just started again, light but steady, darkening the asphalt until everything reflected faintly. The keys were ordinary, resting flat, metal dull under the streetlight, and at first I assumed they belonged to someone else who dropped them in a hurry. I almost walked past them, telling myself it wasn't my problem, but something about their position felt deliberate, like they had been placed instead of dropped. I stopped at the curb and looked closer, my breath fogging slightly in the cool air, and that's when I recognized the blue plastic tag. It was scratched in the same corner I always noticed, worn down from years of being shoved into pockets and bags. For a moment, my mind refused to connect the image on the road with the weight I could still feel in my jacket pocket. I reached into my pocket slowly, my fingers brushing fabric, then metal, and my keys pressed back against my hand, solid and familiar. I pulled them out and held them up, comparing the shapes, the worn grooves, the bent tooth on the apartment key I always meant to replace. They were identical. The ones in my hand felt warm from my body, while the ones on the road looked cold, damp, and strangely flat, and that difference made my stomach tighten. I stood there longer than made sense, rain tapping softly against my hood, looking back and forth like one set might change if I stared hard enough. No cars passed, no footsteps approached, and the silence felt unusually patient. I told myself it was a coincidence, that keys are common, that I was tired and overthinking, but the blue tag argued quietly against all of that. I crouched down and picked up the keys from the road, half expecting them to feel unreal, but they were heavy and solid in my palm. Cold water soaked into my sleeve as I held them, and I became very aware of how quiet my breathing was. Now I had two sets, both exactly the same, and the absurdity of it didn't bring relief the way it should have. I checked the road in both directions, scanning the empty street for someone who might come looking for them, but nothing moved. The streetlight above hummed faintly, its glow steady, offering no explanation. I slid the found keys into my other pocket, telling myself I'd deal with it later, and started walking again, though my pace stayed cautious. Every few steps, I felt the weight of both sets shifting against my legs, a doubled presence that refused to be ignored. The rain grew slightly heavier, blurring the edges of the houses and parked cars, and the world felt less defined the farther I went. I tried not to think about how long those keys must have been there to get that wet, or how they could look so unused and yet so familiar. When I reached my building, I stood under the awning and pulled out my original keys, my hands shaking more than I expected. The lock accepted them easily, the same soft resistance, the same click, and that normal sound made my chest ache with tension. Inside, the lobby lights flickered the way they always did, and the smell of damp concrete wrapped around me, grounding and dull. I paused near the mailboxes and took out the other set, holding both up side by side under the fluorescent light. There was no difference I could see, not even in the tiny scratches I'd memorized over years. I wondered briefly if I'd somehow duplicated them without knowing, the thought ridiculous and unsettling at the same time. I chose one set at random and put the other back in my pocket, telling myself I was too tired to think straight. The elevator ride up felt longer than usual, the hum of the cables louder, and I watched my reflection in the mirrored wall avoid my eyes. When I reached my floor, the hallway was empty, doors closed, the carpet darkened by old stains that never quite faded. I walked to my apartment and unlocked the door again, half expecting something to resist, but it opened smoothly. Inside, everything looked as I'd left it, quiet and still, and the familiarity should have been comforting. I locked the door behind me and leaned against it for a moment, listening to my heartbeat settle. I took both sets of keys out and placed them on the small table by the door, arranging them carefully so I could compare them again. Under the warm apartment light, they looked even more alike, the metal catching the same reflections, the tags the same faded blue. I stood there a long time, staring, waiting for a difference to appear if I was patient enough. Nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I moved away from the table, trying not to look back. That night, I dreamed of walking the same street over and over, always spotting something on the ground just before I woke up uneasy. In the morning, pale light filled the apartment, and for a moment I forgot about the keys entirely. It wasn't until I reached for them to leave that the memory returned, sharp and unwelcome. 2 sets still lay on the table, unchanged, waiting. I picked one up, hesitating, then the other, and the decision of which to take felt heavier than it should have. I left one set behind and slid the other into my pocket, telling myself I'd get rid of the extra later. The walk to work felt normal enough, the city waking around me, rain replaced by a thin, gray sky. But every time my hand brushed my pocket, I felt a quiet doubt settle in my chest. At lunch, I checked my pocket again, just to be sure, and the keys were still there. The reassurance was brief and hollow. That evening, when I returned home, I unlocked the door and stepped inside, already tired. The table by the door was empty. For a moment, I stood very still, listening to the faint sounds of the building, trying to convince myself I'd moved them earlier. I hadn't. I searched the apartment slowly, methodically, checking surfaces, drawers, pockets, even the floor near the door. I found nothing. The keys I'd left behind were gone, and the absence felt louder than their presence ever had. I locked the door with the set I'd brought back and stood there, unsettled by the simplicity of it. That night, I placed the keys carefully in a bowl on my nightstand, wanting them close, wanting proof. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and tense, and I woke more than once reaching for the bowl. Each time, the keys were there, cool and solid under my fingers. Days passed, and nothing else happened, but the normal rhythm of life felt slightly off, like it was missing a beat. I caught myself checking my pockets more often, counting keys without meaning to. One evening, walking home later than usual, I spotted something metal near the curb ahead. My heart sank before I even got close. I stopped a few feet away, rain starting again, and stared at another set of keys lying on the road. Blue tag. Same scratches. I didn't reach for my pocket this time. I stood there, breathing slowly, watching the rain collect around them, and felt a deep, quiet dread settle in. I turned and walked away, leaving them where they were, though every step felt wrong. When I got home, my keys were still with me, unchanged, waiting. I didn't check the road again after that, but sometimes, late at night, I hear a faint metallic sound outside my window. It reminds me of keys shifting slightly, as if moved by something careful and patient. I keep mine close now, always aware of their weight, always wondering how many times I've already found them without noticing. I noticed her because she was standing exactly where people usually stood when they expected something to arrive, right near the edge of the platform beneath the signboard, her posture patient and practiced, as if she had done this many times before. It was late, well past 11, and the station had that hollow sound it only gets at night, where every footstep echoes a little too clearly and then fades into nothing. Rain had followed me all evening, clinging to my jacket and shoes, and the air inside the station smelled faintly of wet concrete and old metal. I had come down to the platform without much thought, more out of habit than intention, checking my phone for the schedule as I walked, already expecting delays. When I looked up at the electronic board, I frowned. The screen was on, glowing pale yellow in the dim station, but it listed nothing. No arrivals. No departures. Just the station name and the current time, ticking forward 1 second at a time. I stood there longer than I meant to, waiting for the information to refresh, for lines of text to scroll in, but the board remained blank. That's when I noticed her again. She hadn't moved. She stood with her hands folded loosely in front of her, facing the tracks, her head slightly tilted upward as if listening for something far away. I assumed she knew something I didn't, that maybe the board was malfunctioning and trains were still running quietly through the night. I checked my phone again, refreshing the transit app, but it showed the same thing, no listings, no warnings, just an empty schedule that felt unfinished. The rain tapped softly against the station roof, steady and unhurried, and the sound made the waiting feel heavier. I glanced around, expecting to see other passengers equally confused, but the platform was almost empty. A man sat on a bench farther down, asleep or pretending to be, his head bowed, unmoving. No one else seemed concerned. I took a few steps closer to the woman, not enough to invade her space, just close enough to confirm she was real. She wore a dark coat, the fabric worn at the edges, and her shoes were damp like mine, suggesting she hadn't just arrived. I cleared my throat softly, testing the silence. She didn't react. I told myself she was listening to something through earbuds I couldn't see, or simply lost in thought, and the explanation felt thin but necessary. I stood beside her now, both of us facing the empty tracks, the rails gleaming faintly under the lights. I waited for the low vibration that usually announced an approaching train, but the ground stayed still beneath my feet. Minutes passed. The time on the board continued to change, but nothing else did. I shifted my weight, the small sound of my shoes against the platform too loud in the quiet. She remained completely still, her attention fixed forward. I tried to see her reflection in the dark glass across the tracks, but the angle was wrong, the image broken by shadows. A faint unease crept in, slow and subtle, the feeling you get when you realize you're the only one reacting to something strange. I asked her quietly if she knew when the next train was coming. My voice echoed more than it should have. She didn't turn her head. She didn't answer. For a moment, I wondered if she hadn't heard me, so I repeated the question, a little louder this time. Nothing changed. Her breathing, if she was breathing, was too subtle to see. I stepped back slightly, embarrassed by my own insistence, and told myself to wait a few more minutes before leaving. The rain grew heavier outside, the sound deepening, and I imagined water running down the tracks, filling spaces no one ever saw. The station lights flickered once, briefly, then steadied, and the sudden change made my heart jump. I looked at the board again, hoping the flicker meant something had reset. Still blank. The woman shifted then, just slightly, and the movement caught my attention sharply. She leaned forward a fraction, as if straining to hear, and I felt a strange relief at the confirmation she was alive, present. I followed her gaze, staring down the tracks into the dark tunnel where the rails disappeared. There was nothing there. No light. No sound. Just darkness swallowing distance. She took a small step closer to the edge of the platform, and I felt an irrational urge to pull her back, even though I didn't know why. The thought stayed with me, uncomfortable and unresolved. I checked the time again. 12:15. No announcements came over the speakers, no distant rumble broke the silence, and the station felt suspended, like it had slipped out of its usual rhythm. I noticed then that the man on the bench hadn't moved at all. His posture was unchanged, his stillness too complete, and the realization made my skin prickle. I considered leaving, going back up to the street where the rain and traffic would feel reassuringly real. But the woman was still waiting. Something about her certainty anchored me there, even as it unsettled me. I watched her profile, the way the light traced her cheek and the edge of her jaw, and tried to imagine where she was going. The idea that she might not be going anywhere settled in quietly. Another few minutes passed, stretching thin and slow. I asked her again, more gently this time, if she was waiting for a specific train. She turned her head slightly, just enough that I could see her face more clearly. Her expression was calm, almost neutral, but her eyes looked unfocused, as if they were fixed on something beyond the tunnel. She spoke then, her voice low and steady, and said that it would arrive when it was ready. The words were ordinary, but the certainty behind them made my chest tighten. I asked her how she knew that. She didn't answer. She turned her face forward again, resuming her quiet watch, and the conversation felt abruptly finished. I stood there, unsure what to do with the discomfort settling in my stomach. I told myself people said strange things all the time, especially late at night, and that it didn't have to mean anything. Still, I found myself watching the tracks more closely now, listening harder, straining for any sign of movement. The rain outside intensified, the sound seeping through the station walls, and I imagined water dripping into places it shouldn't. The time on the board rolled forward again, the only visible proof that anything was moving at all. I realized then that no one new had come down to the platform since I arrived. No footsteps on the stairs. No doors opening above. The station felt closed off, sealed in. I took a step back, the instinct to leave growing stronger, but the woman didn't react. She stayed where she was, waiting, as if my presence or absence didn't matter. I wondered how long she had been there before I arrived, and the thought made me uneasy. I asked her how long she'd been waiting. She smiled faintly, a small, tired expression, and said she wasn't sure anymore. The answer lingered between us, heavy with implication. I looked back at the board, half expecting the listings to suddenly appear, but it remained empty, indifferent. My phone buzzed softly with a low battery warning, and the sound startled me more than it should have. I silenced it quickly, feeling exposed by the noise. The woman shifted her weight again, her shoes scraping lightly against the platform, and my attention snapped back to her. She took another small step forward, now standing uncomfortably close to the edge. I felt that same urge again, stronger this time, to tell her to move back, to wait farther from the drop. Before I could speak, she said quietly that it was almost time. I followed her gaze into the tunnel, my heart beginning to beat faster. Still nothing. No light bloomed in the darkness. No sound approached. The silence pressed in, thick and deliberate. I asked her what she meant, and she didn't respond. She stood perfectly still now, her body tense with expectation, and I felt like an intruder in her moment. The station lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the platform into brief shadow before returning. When the light came back, she was closer to the edge than before. Too close. I opened my mouth to warn her, but the words caught when I noticed something else. Her reflection in the dark glass across the tracks didn't match her movements. It lagged slightly, like it was deciding whether to follow. I blinked, certain I was imagining it, and looked again. The reflection stood still, even as she leaned forward. A cold feeling spread through me, slow and deliberate. I stepped back, my foot scraping loudly, and the sound echoed down the platform. She didn't react. The reflection still hadn't moved. I turned away, my heart pounding now, and started toward the stairs, the decision sudden and absolute. Behind me, I heard a soft sound, like fabric shifting. I didn't turn around. I reached the stairs and paused, my hand on the railing, listening. The platform was quiet again, too quiet, and the rain outside felt very far away. I glanced back once, against my better judgment. The woman was still there, standing at the edge, watching the tunnel. The reflection had caught up. The board above her still listed nothing. I went up the stairs quickly, my footsteps loud and uneven, and pushed out into the rain-soaked street. The night felt suddenly too open, too real, and I stood there breathing hard, trying to slow my thoughts. I checked my phone again, and this time the schedule had returned, lines of text filling the screen as if nothing had ever been missing. Trains listed. Normal delays. Ordinary times. I looked back down toward the station entrance, my chest tight. Through the glass, I could see the platform faintly below. It was empty. No woman. No man on the bench. Just lights and stillness. I walked home under the rain, replaying the moment over and over, trying to find a place where it made sense. Sometimes, late at night, when I check the schedule and see a brief delay, I think about that platform. I think about waiting without knowing for what. And I wonder if she's still there on some version of it, standing patiently beneath a board that never lists what she's waiting for. I noticed the camera because it made a soft mechanical sound that didn't belong to the night, a faint whir that slipped through the steady hush of rain and distant traffic. It was just after midnight, the hour when the street outside my apartment feels less like a place people live and more like something left running on its own, lights on but no one watching. I had stepped out for a walk because I couldn't sleep, pulling my jacket tight as a light drizzle fell. The pavement already dark and reflective. The street cameras had always been there, mounted high on poles at the corners, small and forgettable, the kind of thing you stop noticing once they become part of the background. I passed under the first one without looking up, my shoes tapping softly on the wet concrete, my thoughts unfocused and slow. That's when I heard the sound again, clearer this time, a brief adjustment, like something settling into place. I glanced up out of habit, expecting nothing, and saw the camera angled slightly toward me. At first, I told myself it had always been that way, that I'd just never paid attention before. I kept walking, letting the moment slide past me, even as a quiet tension settled in my shoulders. A few steps later, the sound came again. I stopped. The rain continued to fall, the streetlight buzzed faintly, and somewhere far away a car passed, but the camera moved. Slowly. Deliberately. It rotated on its mount, just enough that the dark lens pointed directly at where I stood. I felt a flicker of embarrassment, as if I'd been caught staring, even though I hadn't done anything. I waved once, a small, uncertain gesture, then let my hand drop, feeling foolish for reacting at all. The camera didn't move after that, and the stillness made the moment feel unfinished. I started walking again, my pace a little quicker, the rain beating on my sleeves. I told myself it was motion activated, that it tracked movement automatically, and the explanation felt thin but comforting. I reached the end of the block and turned the corner, the city opening into a longer, emptier stretch of road. The second camera was mounted there, higher up, barely visible against the dark sky. As I approached, the same sound followed me. A soft turn. A pause. I looked up without stopping this time, my stomach tightening as the lens adjusted to face me. It wasn't sudden or jerky, but smooth, practiced, like it knew exactly how far to move. I slowed down, then stopped completely, standing under the rain with my hands in my pockets. The camera stopped too, holding its position, watching. I became aware of my breathing, of the way my reflection shimmered faintly in the puddles at my feet. No one else was on the street. I waited for the camera to turn away, to reset, but it didn't. After a few seconds, I stepped to the side, testing it. The lens followed, correcting its angle just enough to keep me centered. A chill spread through my arms, slow and unpleasant, and I felt suddenly very alone. I laughed quietly, the sound small and hollow, and shook my head as if that might break whatever pattern I was caught in. "This is stupid," I muttered, though the words felt thin against the quiet. I walked forward again, not looking up, telling myself that if I ignored it, it would stop. The sound followed me anyway, that steady mechanical whisper overhead. With each step, I imagined the camera tracking my progress, logging it, holding onto it longer than necessary. I reached the next intersection and crossed quickly, my shoes splashing through shallow water. The camera on that corner turned too. By now, the feeling in my chest had deepened into something heavier, a dull pressure that made it harder to breathe normally. I stopped in the middle of the crosswalk, rain soaking through my shoes, and looked up. The camera faced me squarely, its dark lens reflecting a tiny distorted version of the streetlight. For a moment, I wondered who was on the other side, if anyone was watching live, or if this was all automated and meaningless. The thought that it might be automated was somehow worse. I finished crossing and leaned against a closed storefront, pretending to check my phone while my eyes stayed fixed upward. The camera held its gaze. I stood there long enough that my phone screen dimmed, the rain tracing slow lines down the glass. Nothing changed. I pushed away from the wall and continued down the street, choosing a longer route, one that wound through quieter residential blocks. The rain eased slightly, leaving the air damp and cold, and the sound of my footsteps felt too loud. At the next corner, I hesitated before stepping forward, already anticipating what would happen. The camera turned as soon as I entered its range, the motion so smooth it felt rehearsed. I stopped again, my heart beating faster now, and raised my head slowly. This one adjusted twice, a small correction after the first turn, as if refining its focus. The realization that it was keeping me centered made my mouth go dry. I took a step back, then another, retreating out of the corner's light. The camera paused, then rotated slightly farther, stretching its angle to keep me in frame. I felt a sudden urge to leave the street entirely, to duck into an alley or doorway, but the buildings around me were closed and dark. The idea of being watched without interruption pressed in on me, quiet and relentless. I turned around and walked back the way I'd come, testing whether the camera would give up once I moved away. It followed until I was nearly out of sight, then stopped, holding its final position like it was waiting. My shoulders ached with tension, and I became acutely aware of how exposed I felt under the open sky. I picked up my pace, rain starting again in earnest, the sound of it blurring the edges of the world. At the next intersection, I didn't slow down. The camera there turned anyway, catching me mid-step. Its lens tilting down just enough to keep me framed. Something about the timing felt wrong, like it had anticipated me. I crossed the street without looking up and kept going, my breathing shallow now. By the time I reached my own block, my hands were trembling slightly inside my pockets. I told myself that once I turned onto the smaller side street, out of the main grid, it would stop. The camera at the corner turned as soon as I stepped beneath it. I stopped directly under it, rain dripping from my hair, and looked straight up. The lens stared back, dark and unreadable, and the whirring sound faded into silence. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I felt an irrational urge to apologize, though I didn't know what for. Then, slowly, the camera tilted downward, lowering its angle beyond what seemed necessary, as if adjusting for my height. My stomach dropped. I took a step back, then another, and the camera followed, matching me exactly. I turned and walked quickly toward my building, not running, but close to it. I didn't look up again, but I could hear the sound behind me, faint but steady, like footsteps that weren't quite footsteps. When I reached my door, I fumbled with my keys, dropping them once before getting the lock to turn. I slipped inside and shut the door hard behind me, my heart pounding in the sudden quiet. The lobby lights hummed softly, unchanged, and the normalcy felt almost surreal. I stood there for a moment, listening, half expecting to hear the camera through the walls. Nothing followed me inside. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, moving quickly, my mind replaying the slow turns, the steady tracking. Inside my apartment, I locked the door and leaned against it, breathing deeply until the shaking in my hands eased. I told myself it was over, that whatever glitch or coincidence had happened was finished now. Still, I avoided the windows for the rest of the night. Sleep came late and lightly, broken by half-formed dreams of movement and quiet mechanical sounds. In the morning, sunlight filled the room, and the memory of the night felt distant, almost exaggerated. I convinced myself I'd been tired, anxious, looking for patterns that weren't there. On my way to work that evening, I forced myself to walk the same route, determined not to let the fear linger. The rain returned as if on cue, soft and persistent, darkening the streets. I passed under the first camera and didn't hear anything. Relief washed over me, tentative and cautious. Then, a few steps later, the sound came. The camera turned. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Just enough to let me know it had noticed me again. I didn't stop this time. I kept walking, my gaze forward, my jaw tight. Behind me, I could hear the faint adjustment, keeping pace, staying with me longer than felt necessary. I didn't look back. I don't look up at street cameras anymore. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain is steady and the streets are quiet, I hear that soft mechanical sound through my window. And even without seeing it, I know something out there is still making small, careful adjustments, making sure I haven't gone anywhere at all. The first thing I noticed was the quiet, the kind that settles in a building late at night when even the pipes seem to hold their breath, and I remember thinking how unusually still the lobby felt as I pushed the glass door open. It was raining again, a steady, fine rain that clung to my coat and made the city smell like wet concrete and old leaves, and I was tired in a way that dulled everything except small details. The lobby lights were on, casting a pale yellow glow across the tiled floor, and the security desk sat empty as usual at that hour, its chair pushed in neatly. I stepped inside and felt the warmth immediately, that soft shift from damp cold to artificial heat that always made me sigh without realizing it. The glass door swung shut behind me with a muted thump, sealing off the sound of the rain, and the sudden silence made my footsteps feel louder than they should have. Out of habit, I glanced at the tall mirror mounted on the wall opposite the entrance, the one that showed the door, the mailboxes, and anyone who came in or out. For a second, my reflection was there, rain-dark coat, tired face, shoulders slightly hunched, exactly as I expected. Then I took another step forward. My reflection didn't. I stopped walking immediately, my foot hovering awkwardly before settling back down, and my heart gave a small, confused jolt. In the mirror, I was still standing by the door, hand near my side, posture frozen in a moment that had already passed. I blinked hard, certain my eyes were playing a trick on me, and leaned slightly to the side, testing the angle. The reflection remained where it was, perfectly still, eyes forward, not following the movement. A quiet, uneasy feeling crept up my spine, subtle but persistent, like the beginning of a headache you can't quite place. I took a cautious step backward, closer to the door, and felt my heel touch the mat near the entrance. In the mirror, the reflected version of me didn't move back or forward, just stayed there, watching. I laughed softly, an automatic response to discomfort, and told myself it was a lag, a trick of the lighting, anything ordinary enough to explain it. The sound of my laugh echoed faintly off the lobby walls, and my reflection didn't react to that either. I raised my hand slowly, fingers spreading, my eyes locked on the mirror. In real time, my hand lifted into the air. In the mirror, my hand stayed at my side. The gap between what I felt and what I saw made my stomach tighten in a slow, unpleasant way. I lowered my hand again and stood very still, listening to the faint hum of the lights above, trying to ground myself in something solid. The reflection remained frozen, not like a paused video, but like someone choosing not to move. I noticed then that its expression wasn't quite right, the eyes focused but distant, the mouth set in a neutral line that felt deliberate. I took a step farther into the lobby, away from the door, my shoes tapping softly on the tile. The distance between me and my reflection increased, the space stretching in a way that made me feel oddly exposed. I turned my head slightly, checking the rest of the lobby, half expecting someone else to be there, watching this happen. The mailboxes were closed and quiet, the elevator doors shut, the hallway beyond empty and dim. I looked back at the mirror. The reflection still stood by the door, as if waiting for something to catch up. I swallowed and took another step forward, then another, my breathing shallow now, my attention narrowed to that one unmoving figure behind the glass. With each step, the feeling grew heavier, a sense that I was leaving something behind without meaning to. I tried speaking, just my name, spoken softly into the quiet space. My voice sounded normal, real, and it echoed faintly off the walls. In the mirror, my reflection's lips did not move. That was when the discomfort shifted into something colder. I stood there, halfway across the lobby now, rainwater dripping slowly from the hem of my coat onto the floor, and watched myself not respond. The idea that it might start moving suddenly felt worse than it staying still. I took a step toward the mirror, drawn by a need to be closer, to understand what I was seeing. As I approached, I noticed small details I hadn't before, the way the reflected coat seemed slightly darker, the way the eyes looked just a little too focused. I stopped an arm's length from the glass and raised my hand again, placing my palm near the surface without touching it. My reflection's hand stayed at its side. The glass felt cold even without contact, the space between us tense and deliberate. I leaned in slightly, trying to meet my own eyes, and felt a strange pressure behind my forehead. For a brief moment, I wondered if the reflection was waiting for me to do something specific. The thought lingered, uncomfortable and unexplained. I stepped back suddenly, breaking the closeness, my heart beating faster than it should have. The reflection didn't react, didn't flinch, didn't follow. The lobby felt larger now, the ceiling higher, the lights harsher, and I became acutely aware of how alone I was in that space. I turned away from the mirror and started toward the elevator, telling myself I just needed to get upstairs, to my apartment, where things made sense. Each step felt heavier, like moving through thick air, and I resisted the urge to look back. The elevator button lit up when I pressed it, a small, reassuring response, and I focused on that tiny point of normalcy. While I waited, I felt the urge again, stronger this time, to check the mirror. I turned my head despite myself. My reflection was still there, standing by the door, now farther away, smaller, but no less focused. The distance between us felt wrong, stretched beyond what the lobby should allow. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and the sound made me flinch. I stepped inside quickly and turned to face the doors, my reflection momentarily replaced by dull metal. As the doors slid shut, I caught one last glimpse of the lobby mirror through the narrowing gap. My reflection hadn't moved. The elevator began to rise, the gentle hum of motion grounding and unsettling at the same time. I leaned against the wall, my breath shallow, trying to convince myself that stress and exhaustion were enough to explain what I'd seen. When the elevator reached my floor, I stepped out into the hallway, the familiar carpet and dim lights offering a fragile sense of relief. I walked to my apartment door and unlocked it, my hand steadier than I felt inside. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and stood in the quiet, listening to the building settle. I didn't turn on the lights right away. Instead, I stood there in the darkness, thinking about the mirror downstairs and the version of me still standing by the door. Eventually, I moved deeper into the apartment, letting the space reclaim me, though the feeling of separation lingered. That night, I avoided mirrors entirely, turning away from my bathroom reflection, dressing in the dark, letting sleep come slowly and unevenly. In the morning, daylight made everything feel less threatening, and I almost convinced myself it had been nothing. Almost. As I left for work, I hesitated at the lobby entrance, my hand on the door, my eyes fixed straight ahead. I didn't look at the mirror. I could feel it there anyway, waiting, and the certainty that it might still be standing where I left it followed me out into the rain. I noticed the footprints because they didn't quite touch the ground, and that realization came slowly, the way unsettling things often do, after my mind had already accepted them as normal. It was late, close to 1 in the morning, and the rain had finally stopped after hours of steady falling, leaving the streets damp and reflective under the streetlights. I was walking home from a friend's place, taking the longer route again because the quiet helped me think, or maybe because I didn't want to think at all. The air was cold enough to sting my lungs slightly, and a thin mist hovered just above the pavement, drifting lazily in the gaps between pools of light. My footsteps were the only clear sound, soft and rhythmic, and I remember feeling calm in that careful way you do when the night feels empty but not threatening. That calm shifted when I saw the first footprint. It appeared just ahead of me, a faint dark shape in the mist, like a wet mark left by a shoe. At first, I assumed someone else had walked through recently, maybe just out of sight, and the idea didn't bother me. I kept walking, my pace steady, watching as another footprint appeared a little farther ahead, then another. They were spaced normally, the right distance apart, leading straight down the sidewalk. What caught my attention was how clean they were, each one perfectly formed, untouched by the uneven texture of the concrete. I slowed slightly, my eyes tracing the line they made, and that was when I realized something felt off. The footprints weren't darkening the pavement. They weren't pressed into anything. They hovered just above the ground, suspended in the thin layer of mist-like reflections that had lost their surface. I stopped walking, my breath catching without my permission, and leaned forward slightly to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. The nearest footprint stayed exactly where it was, sharp and clear, its edges crisp against the drifting fog. I took a cautious step closer, my shoe landing solidly on the wet concrete beneath it. My foot passed right through the footprint without disturbing it. A quiet chill ran up my legs, subtle but insistent, and I straightened slowly, suddenly very aware of my surroundings. The street was empty in both directions, buildings dark, windows closed, and the mist moved gently as if nothing unusual was happening. I told myself it was condensation, some trick of temperature and light, and the explanation almost worked until the footprint started moving again. One appeared a few feet ahead, then another, each one forming in sequence, as if someone unseen was walking away from me. They rose into existence just above the pavement, lingered for a moment, then faded as the next one appeared. I stayed where I was, my hands hanging uselessly at my sides, watching the pattern continue down the sidewalk. The spacing was careful, unhurried, like someone taking their time. I felt an urge to call out, to say something simple and grounding, but the idea of breaking the silence felt wrong. Instead, I listened to my own breathing, too loud in my ears, and tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The footprints reached the edge of the next streetlight's glow and stopped. For a moment, nothing happened, and the mist filled the space again, soft and empty. I waited, my body tense, unsure whether I wanted the footprints to continue or not. When they appeared again, they were closer. This time, the first one formed only a few steps in front of me, hovering at the same impossible height. My heart rate picked up, and I took a step back without thinking, my heel scraping quietly against the pavement. The footprint didn't react, didn't change, just stayed where it was, patient. Another appeared behind it, then another, forming a line that now pointed toward me instead of away. I felt suddenly exposed, standing in the open with nothing but mist and silence around me. I looked up instinctively, scanning the street for a source, for a shape or shadow that might explain it. There was nothing there. The footprints continued their slow approach, each one forming, hovering, fading, replaced by the next, like a careful rehearsal. I told myself to move, to step aside, to do anything other than stand there watching, but my legs felt heavy. When the next footprint appeared directly in front of me, close enough that I could see the tread pattern clearly, I flinched. It looked like a shoe I recognized, a common design, worn in places that suggested familiarity. The thought made my stomach tighten. I stepped to the side, breaking the line, and held my breath. The next footprint adjusted its position slightly, correcting its path, continuing forward as if I hadn't moved. That small adjustment unsettled me more than anything else. It meant whatever was leaving them was aware of me. I backed away slowly, my movements careful, not wanting to draw attention, even though that felt impossible now. The footprints kept coming, maintaining their pace, never speeding up, never slowing down, as if confident I wouldn't leave. I reached the edge of a driveway and stopped, my back nearly to the wall of a closed shop. The mist thickened slightly, softening the edges of everything, and the streetlight above flickered once. The footprints paused again, hovering in place, close enough now that the space between us felt intimate. I waited for something else to happen, for a sound, a shape, a presence to finally reveal itself. Nothing did. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, and I felt a strange pressure behind my eyes, like the beginning of a thought I didn't want to finish. One footprint formed closer than the others, almost directly beneath my gaze. I realized then that they weren't aligned with the ground at all, but with me, adjusting subtly to my height, my position. The understanding settled in quietly, without panic, and that made it worse. I turned my head slowly, just enough to check the street behind me, considering whether I could walk past them, break the pattern. As I shifted, the footprints shifted too, the next one appearing at a slight angle, matching my new orientation. I felt a faint sense of being studied, not hurried or aggressive, just observed. The idea that this wasn't meant to frighten me crept in, unwelcome and persistent. I took a careful step forward, testing the space between us, and the footprints stopped appearing. For a long moment, there were none at all, just mist and damp pavement and my own reflection faintly visible in a dark window. I waited, my heart pounding softly, and almost convinced myself it was over. Then a single footprint appeared behind me. I didn't turn around right away. I could feel it there without seeing it, hovering in the space I had just occupied. Another formed beside it, then another, rearranging themselves slowly, like something deciding where to stand. I stepped forward again, my movement small and deliberate, and felt the space behind me adjust in response. I began walking then, not fast, not slow, just moving, letting instinct guide me. The footprints followed, always just behind, never overtaking me, never falling too far back. I could see them in the reflections of windows as I passed, faint shapes suspended in the mist, keeping pace. The sound of my own footsteps felt wrong now, too solid compared to theirs. I reached my building and stopped under the awning, the familiar shape offering little comfort. I turned slowly, my breath shallow, and looked back down the street. The footprints hovered there in a loose cluster, as if waiting for instruction. They didn't come any closer. After a few seconds, they began to fade, one by one, dissolving back into the mist until the sidewalk was empty again. I stood there longer than necessary, listening, watching, trying to be sure it was really over. Eventually, I unlocked the door and went inside, the warmth of the lobby feeling unreal against my skin. I didn't look back out the glass. That night, lying in bed, I kept thinking about the way they had adjusted to me, how carefully they had followed without ever touching the ground. Sometimes now, when the air is cold and the mist hangs low, I feel that same awareness on quiet streets. I watched the space just behind me more than I should. I haven't seen the footprints again, but I'm no longer certain that means they aren't there. The first thing I noticed was the music, because it was too familiar for that late hour, and because I hadn't heard it in years. It was just past midnight when I stepped into the elevator of my building, rainwater still clinging to my coat, the hallway outside dim and quiet in the way it always is when most people are asleep. The doors slid shut with their usual soft thud, and the elevator began its slow descent, the cables humming faintly above me. That was when the music started, low and tinny through the ceiling speaker, a gentle instrumental tune meant to be ignored. I almost didn't register it at first, my mind elsewhere, replaying the day in fragments, feeling that dull exhaustion that makes everything feel slightly unreal. Then a phrase in the music caught my attention, a small sequence of notes that felt strangely personal. I frowned slightly, listening more closely, and felt a mild unease settle in my chest as I realized I recognized the melody. It was the same elevator music that played in the hospital where my mother had stayed years ago, the one I used to ride every evening after work. The memory came back quietly, uninvited, the smell of disinfectant, the soft buzz of fluorescent lights, the way time seemed to stretch endlessly in those rides. I told myself it was coincidence, that generic music often sounded similar, and leaned back against the wall as the elevator continued down. The tune played on, calm and looping. And I watched the floor numbers light up one by one. Halfway down, the music stopped. For a brief second, there was only the hum of the elevator and my own breathing, and I felt oddly relieved. Then the music started again, from the very beginning. The same opening notes, the same gentle rise and fall, exactly as before. I glanced up at the speaker, then at the control panel, as if either might offer an explanation. The elevator didn't slow or stop, didn't jerk or hesitate, and the lights remained steady. Still, something about the restart made my skin prickle. I told myself the system probably looped the track, that it was nothing unusual, and shifted my weight from one foot to the other. As the music played, I noticed small details I hadn't before, a faint distortion in the sound, like an old recording played too many times. The elevator passed another floor, then another, the numbers glowing softly. The tune ended again. And once more, it restarted from the beginning. This time, my stomach tightened slightly. The repetition felt deliberate, not random, and the familiarity of the melody pressed on memories I preferred to keep distant. I remembered standing in that hospital elevator late at night, listening to the same loop while trying not to think about what waited at the end of the ride. The elevator in my building slowed as it approached the lobby, the music still playing, calm and patient. When the doors opened, the tune stopped abruptly, cutting off mid-note. The lobby was empty, quiet, and dimly lit, and the sudden absence of sound made the space feel hollow. I stepped out and paused for a moment, half expecting the music to resume, but it didn't. I walked toward the exit, the rain visible through the glass doors, and pushed the experience aside as just another odd thing in a long day. The next morning, I rode the elevator again, this time heading up, sunlight spilling faintly into the lobby. The music played. But it was different, a generic tune I didn't recognize, looping normally without interruption. I felt a small sense of relief and almost laughed at myself for having been unsettled the night before. For a few days, nothing happened. Then, late one evening, after another long day, I stepped into the elevator again, alone. The doors closed, the hum began, and the familiar melody returned. The same one. The first note settled into my chest like a weight, and I felt my shoulders tense without realizing it. I stood very still, listening, counting the seconds between notes, watching the floor numbers with more focus than necessary. The tune reached its end. Restarted. Exactly the same way as before. I pressed the button for my floor again, just to be sure, and the panel beeped softly in response. The elevator continued its steady climb, unaffected by my growing unease. As the music looped a third time, I noticed something new. A faint pause between two notes, so brief it could have been imagined, but it wasn't there the first time. It felt like a hesitation. I leaned my head back against the wall and closed my eyes for a moment, trying to steady my thoughts. Images surfaced without warning, my mother asleep under thin white sheets, the quiet beeping of machines, the way the elevator doors used to open onto that long hallway. I opened my eyes quickly, the present snapping back into place, the small enclosed space suddenly feeling tighter. The music ended. Restarted. Now with that same faint pause. I exhaled slowly and stared at the speaker, a strange thought forming that I didn't want to acknowledge. The elevator reached my floor and the doors slid open, the music cutting off mid-phrase again. I stepped out quickly, not looking back, my footsteps echoing softly down the hallway. That night, I dreamed of elevators. Not falling or crashing, just riding endlessly, the same tune playing over and over, each loop slightly more distorted than the last. When I woke, the melody lingered in my head longer than it should have. Over the next week, it happened twice more, always late at night, always when I was alone. The same song. The same looping restart. And each time, the pause between notes grew just a little longer. I started taking the stairs when I could, telling myself it was for exercise, though the climb left me breathless and tense. On the nights I couldn't avoid the elevator, I stood with my back to the wall, eyes fixed on the floor numbers, listening despite myself. The music felt closer now, less like background noise and more like something being played for me specifically. One night, as the tune looped again, I noticed something else. The pause wasn't random anymore. It aligned with my breathing. When I held my breath, the pause stretched. When I exhaled, the music resumed. I tested it again, heart pounding softly, and felt a cold clarity settle in. The elevator slowed, approaching my floor, and the music hesitated, hanging in silence for just a fraction too long. Then it continued, finishing the phrase as the doors opened. I didn't move right away. The lobby was empty, quiet, waiting. The music stopped, but the silence felt shaped, as if something expected me to notice it. I stepped out eventually and walked down the hallway, the melody still echoing faintly in my thoughts. Since then, the elevator music during the day is always normal. At night, it's unpredictable. Sometimes it's silent. Sometimes it's a tune I don't recognize. And sometimes, when the building is very still and I'm very tired, I hear that familiar melody begin again. I've stopped trying to remember exactly where I first heard it. What unsettles me now is the feeling that it remembers me. I noticed the poster because it was new, and because it looked out of place on that street where nothing ever changed, especially not overnight. It was late, a little after 11, and the rain had just started again, that thin, steady drizzle that makes streetlights smear into long yellow lines on the pavement. I was walking home from the bus stop, collar turned up, hands in my pockets, moving at the unthinking pace of someone who had taken the same route too many times. The street was quiet, almost hollow, with most shop shutters pulled down and only a few apartment windows still lit. That was when I saw it taped to the brick wall beside a closed pharmacy, slightly crooked, its edges already damp and curling. At first glance, I assumed it was an advertisement or maybe a missing person notice, something ordinary enough to ignore. I slowed anyway, mostly out of habit, and leaned in just enough for the streetlight to catch the paper. The top line was printed in plain black letters, no logo, no image, just text. It read, "Man wearing a dark jacket." I frowned slightly, more puzzled than alarmed, because half the people on that street were wearing dark jackets that night. I kept reading. Dark jacket with a loose thread on the left sleeve. My hand twitched inside my pocket before I realized why, my fingers brushing against the frayed thread I kept meaning to trim. I leaned closer, rain tapping softly against the wall above me, my breath fogging the paper. Black jeans, worn at the knees. I shifted my weight without thinking, feeling the fabric pull where it was thinnest. The unease came slowly, like something creeping up behind a familiar thought. I told myself it was coincidence, that the description was vague enough to apply to anyone, and yet I couldn't bring myself to step away. The next line read, "Brown shoes, damp at the toes." I looked down before I could stop myself, noticing the darker patches where the rain had soaked in. The street felt suddenly quieter, the sound of traffic from the main road muted, distant. I scanned the rest of the street instinctively, half expecting someone to be watching me read. There was no one there. I turned back to the poster, my heart beat a little faster now, and continued. Standing under the third streetlight from the corner. A small, uncomfortable laugh escaped me, thin and nervous, because that was exactly where I was standing. I stepped sideways, just one pace, testing the space. The streetlight buzzed faintly above, indifferent. I read the next line. Reading this notice. The words sat there plainly, no emphasis, no punctuation to soften them. For a moment, my mind simply refused to process it, as if skipping over something too awkward to acknowledge. Then the meaning settled in, heavy and precise. I straightened slowly, the rain suddenly colder on the back of my neck, and took another look around. The street remained empty, unchanged, the wet pavement reflecting my own distorted shape back at me. I leaned closer again, compelled despite myself, and noticed something I hadn't before. The ink on the lower half of the poster looked fresher, darker, as if it had been added more recently. My stomach tightened as I read on. Left hand in jacket pocket. I pulled my hand out immediately, the movement sharp and deliberate. The poster didn't change. Right hand holding a phone with a cracked screen. My grip loosened, and I stared down at the thin fracture running across the glass, catching the light. The rain seemed louder now, each drop distinct, tapping against metal, glass, paper. I stepped back fully this time, creating space between myself and the wall, my heart beating hard enough to feel in my throat. I told myself it was a prank, some elaborate joke meant to unsettle passers-by. Though I couldn't imagine who it was meant for besides me. I checked the top of the poster again, searching for a date, a signature, anything that suggested context. There was nothing. Just text. I turned to leave, forcing my feet to move, but after 2 steps I stopped again. The urge to look was too strong, like leaving a sentence unfinished. When I faced the poster again, my breath caught. There was a new line at the bottom. Just stepped back. A cold, tight sensation spread across my chest, and I stood very still, afraid of what might appear next. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze, its surface rippling as rainwater traced thin paths downward. I waited, counting my breaths, listening for footsteps, voices, anything. Nothing came. Another line appeared. Heart rate elevated. I swallowed hard, the motion loud in my ears. I took another step back, then another, my movements slow and careful. The poster remained where it was, passive and patient. Creating distance. The words felt less like description now and more like observation. I turned fully away then and started walking, not fast, not running, just moving, my shoulders tense. I didn't look back until I reached the corner, my pulse still racing. From there, the poster was just a pale rectangle against the brick, unreadable at that distance. I told myself not to go back, not to feed whatever this was, and headed home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the poster, imagined new lines forming in the dark. In the morning, daylight made everything seem smaller, less threatening. On my way to work, I took the same street, curiosity pulling me along despite my better judgment. The wall beside the pharmacy was bare. No poster, no tape marks, no damp paper stuck to the bricks. I stood there longer than necessary, feeling foolish and uneasy at the same time. For a few days, nothing happened. Then, one evening, on a different street, I noticed another poster. This one was taped to a bus shelter, the glass fogged slightly from the cold. I didn't read it right away. I stood there, rain falling softly, feeling a familiar tension settle into my shoulders. Finally, I looked. It described a woman sitting on the bench, scrolling through her phone, waiting for a bus. I realized with a quiet jolt that it wasn't describing me anymore. I walked away without reading further, my steps quickening. Since then, I notice posters more than I used to. Not because they're everywhere, but because sometimes, late at night, I get the sense they're waiting. And I've started paying closer attention to what I'm wearing, even when no one seems to be looking. I first noticed the feeling before I noticed her, a faint pressure around my fingers as if someone had already decided to hold my hand before actually doing it. It was late, nearly midnight, and the rain had been falling on and off all evening, leaving the sidewalk slick and shining under the streetlights. I was walking home from the tram stop, shoulders tight against the cold, my hands buried deep in my coat pockets, trying not to think too much about anything. The street was familiar, quiet in that way that feels peaceful until you realize how alone you really are. I remember slowing down near the small park because the lamps there flicker sometimes, and I always like to watch them struggle to stay lit. That was when the sensation returned, clearer this time, like warm air brushing the skin between my fingers. I stopped walking, my heart giving a small, confused jump, and pulled my right hand out of my pocket to check if something had brushed against it. There was nothing there, just cold air and the faint sound of rain tapping leaves. I stood still for a moment, listening, half expecting to hear footsteps approaching from behind me. The street remained empty, and the feeling faded slightly, though it didn't disappear completely. I told myself it was nerves, or fatigue, or the way cold sometimes makes your body invent sensations, and I started walking again with unease lingering. A few steps later, I noticed her standing near the edge of the park path, partially under a tree where the light didn't quite reach. She looked ordinary enough at first, wearing a long coat and standing with her arms loosely crossed, as if she were waiting for someone. I slowed instinctively, not out of fear exactly, but because something about her stillness felt deliberate. As I passed, she turned her head slightly, and our eyes met for just a second too long. She didn't smile, didn't frown, just watched me with an expression that felt unfinished. I nodded out of habit and kept walking, the sound of my shoes loud against the wet pavement. After a few steps, the feeling returned, stronger this time, wrapping gently around my hand like a memory. I stopped again, breath shallow, and looked down at my fingers, half expecting to see something already there. Before I could react, I felt it clearly, unmistakably, the sensation of fingers sliding between mine. My body tensed before my mind caught up, and I froze in place, staring at my hand as if it had betrayed me. Then, slowly, her hand appeared, moving into view from my side, aligning perfectly with the feeling I had already been having. She was holding my hand, but it felt like she was arriving late to something that had already started. I turned my head toward her, my heart pounding softly, and saw that she was standing much closer now. Her grip was gentle, not tight or demanding, warm despite the cold air, and oddly familiar. I should have pulled away, said something, anything, but my body didn't seem interested in doing what it should. She looked down at our hands, then back up at me. Her expression calm in a way that unsettled me. "I didn't want to surprise you," she said quietly, though her mouth barely seemed to move. Her voice sounded like it was meant to be heard from farther away. I tried to speak, but my throat felt dry, and all I managed was a small breath that fogged the air between us. The rain picked up slightly, soft and steady, as if giving us privacy. I became acutely aware of the fact that I couldn't remember deciding to stop walking. I asked her who she was, though the question felt wrong the moment it left my mouth. She tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether the answer mattered. "You already know how this feels," she said instead, her thumb brushing lightly against my knuckle. The touch sent a quiet shiver through me, not fear exactly, but recognition. I realized then that the sensation I'd felt earlier hadn't been random at all. It had been anticipation. The thought made my stomach tighten, and I finally pulled my hand away, the separation feeling heavier than it should have. She didn't resist, just let her hand fall back to her side, watching me carefully. The air between us felt charged, like a space where something had almost happened. I stepped back once, then again, creating distance that felt necessary but incomplete. She stayed where she was, her posture relaxed, as if she had all the time in the world. "You felt it before I touched you," she said softly, not as a question. I nodded despite myself, unsure why I was being honest. She smiled then, just slightly, and the expression didn't reach her eyes. "That's how it's supposed to be," she said, and the words settled uncomfortably in my chest. I asked her what she meant, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She glanced down the street, toward the direction I'd been walking, then back at me. "Sometimes the body remembers things before the mind does," she said, her tone almost gentle. The rain seemed louder suddenly, each drop distinct, filling the silence she left behind. I felt an urge to leave, strong and immediate, and finally turned away from her. As I walked, I expected to feel relief, but the absence of her hand felt like something missing rather than something removed. I didn't look back until I reached the end of the street, my pulse still uneven. She was gone, the space under the tree empty, the shadows unchanged. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the damp air, trying to convince myself it had been a strange but harmless encounter. That night, lying in bed, I felt the sensation again, faint but clear, the echo of fingers against mine. I sat up quickly, turning on the lamp, my hand resting on the blanket. There was nothing there, but the warmth lingered longer than it should have. Over the next few days, it happened again in small, quiet moments. Standing in line at a cafe, walking down a hallway, sitting alone on a bench, I would feel it briefly, that same gentle pressure. Each time, it came before any contact, before any visible presence. I began to dread it and anticipate it at the same time. One evening, a week later, I took the same route home, telling myself I was just being stubborn. The rain returned, light and patient, and the streetlights flickered as usual. As I approached the park, my hand tingled softly, the sensation blooming slowly. I stopped walking before she appeared. This time, I didn't wait for her to touch me. I looked down at my hand and felt it being held, clearly and completely. Then I looked up. She was standing in front of me, closer than before, her hand already where it felt like it belonged. "You're getting better at noticing," she said quietly, her voice calm and certain. I didn't answer, my attention fixed on the fact that I couldn't remember when my hand had moved. The rain fell around us, steady and soft, and the street felt far away. I wondered then if the feeling would ever stop coming first. She tightened her grip just slightly, not enough to trap me, just enough to remind me. And I realized with a slow, sinking unease that even if she let go, my hand might still remember. I noticed the door before I noticed anything else, because it wasn't how it was supposed to be, and because I was already tired enough to crave routine more than comfort. It was close to 1 in the morning when I reached my building, the rain thinning into a light mist that clung to my clothes and softened every sound. The street was empty in that late-night way that makes even familiar places feel borrowed, like you're passing through someone else's memory. I unlocked the main entrance and climbed the stairs slowly, listening to my footsteps echo and fade, each one landing a little heavier than the last. By the time I reached my floor, my thoughts had narrowed to small things: dry socks, warm tea, the quiet relief of being alone. That was when I saw my apartment door. It was open. Not wide open, not inviting, just open enough to be wrong, the latch visible, the gap dark and narrow. I stopped a few feet away and stood there, letting the image settle, waiting for the shock to bloom into panic. It didn't, not right away, and that delay unsettled me more than fear would have. I stared at the door, half expecting it to move, to close itself, to do anything that would explain why it was like that. The hallway was silent, the overhead light buzzing faintly, and the carpet smelled faintly of damp fabric and old cleaner. I told myself I must have forgotten to lock it, though the thought felt thin and unconvincing. I am careful about doors, especially at night. I stood there long enough to feel the cold seep through my coat, my breath steady but shallow. Slowly, I stepped closer, each movement deliberate, my attention fixed on the narrow strip of darkness beyond the threshold. I listened for sounds from inside, footsteps, voices, the hum of my fridge, anything that would anchor the space. There was nothing. The silence inside my apartment felt deeper than the hallways, thicker, as if it had been waiting. I reached out and pushed the door open the rest of the way, the hinges barely making a sound. The familiar layout revealed itself in pieces: the couch, the small table, the darkened kitchen beyond. Everything looked normal, untouched, and that almost made me relax. Almost. I stood in the doorway for a moment longer, scanning corners, shadows, the places my eyes always go when I enter a room at night. Nothing moved. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the click of the lock sounding louder than usual. The apartment smelled the same as always, faintly of detergent and the lingering trace of coffee from earlier. I dropped my keys into the bowl by the door and noticed my hand was shaking slightly. I told myself it was the cold. I didn't turn on the lights right away, letting the soft glow from the street lamps filter in through the curtains. I stood there, listening, counting the seconds, waiting for something to break the quiet. Nothing did. I moved deeper into the apartment, checking rooms one by one, my steps careful, my body tense in a way I tried not to name. The bathroom was empty, the bedroom untouched, the bed still neatly made from that morning. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. That should have been comforting, but instead it made the open door feel heavier, more deliberate. I sat down on the edge of the couch and let out a slow breath, my shoulders aching with the effort of staying calm. I replayed the evening in my head, leaving the house, locking the door, feeling the familiar resistance of the key. The memory felt solid, but memory can be shaped by expectation. I checked my phone, half hoping to see a message explaining everything.